The temperature is minus 40 degrees. Winds are blowing at 100 kilometers per hour. Waves reach 10 meters high, and each one carries a death threat. It's impossible to even keep your eyes open because your eyelashes freeze. The moment you touch your hands to a metal surface, your skin sticks and tears off. And in the midst of all this, Nazi submarines wait silently in the dark waters, hunting you. This isn't a horror movie script. This was the daily reality for British sailors assigned to the most dangerous mission of World War II. If you're watching this channel for the first time, we tell the stories of history's forgotten heroes and their incredible tales. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because this story will deeply move you. Now, let's get into our story. The Arctic Convoys. Perhaps you've never heard this name before. Perhaps you've only seen it as a footnote in history books. But let me tell you this, these convoys were one of the most critical and deadliest operations of World War II. Winston Churchill described this route as the worst journey in the world. And behind those words lay the sacrifice of thousands of British and American sailors. Our story begins in 1941. Nazi Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, and the Eastern Front had opened up. Stalin's armies were fighting desperately, but their need for weapons, ammunition, tanks, and aircraft was dire. It was at this exact moment that the Allied forces decided to establish history's most dangerous supply line, the Arctic Convoys. The mission of these convoys was simple, but its execution was nearly impossible. Hundreds of ships departing from Britain and America would cross the Arctic Ocean to reach the Soviet Union's ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The cargo they carried was significant enough to change the course of the war. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, weapons, ammunition, food, and fuel. But this route passed through the world's most merciless geography. Sailing only a few hundred miles off the coast of northern Norway, the convoys were practically within waving distance of German air bases and naval bases. Luftwaffe bombers, kriegsmarine warships, and the most feared of all, the Nazi submarines known as U-boats, waited in ambush to destroy these convoys. And as if that weren't enough, there was nature itself. The Arctic winter was the most ruthless enemy imaginable. During winter months, the sun wouldn't rise for weeks. Ships advanced through polar darkness, threatened not only by enemy torpedoes, but also by massive icebergs. The seawater was so cold that when a sailor fell in, their survival time was only a few minutes. Often, it was impossible to rescue a fallen comrade because the moment the convoy stopped, all ships became targets. Now, I'm going to tell you the story of a British ship. This ship is mentioned in official records with just a few lines, but a crew member's diary reveals the drama that unfolded among the ice in all its rawness. November 1942, HMS Eastern Star departed from Liverpool Harbor. The ship had 112 crew members. Most were under 20 years old. Among them were young men who had never seen the open sea before. But they were all volunteers. They had all willingly signed out for this dangerous mission. The ship's second engineer, Thomas, was a 23-year-old young man from Birmingham. Before the war, he worked in a factory. His fiancée Sarah was waiting for him at home. Thomas began keeping a diary before they set sail. This diary would later be found on the abandoned ship among the ice and would become one of history's most harrowing testimonies. On the first page of his diary, Thomas wrote, "We left Liverpool today. The weather is cold but still bearable. Crew morale is high. Everyone understands the importance of our mission. Stalin's men are waiting for the weapons we are carrying. We must deliver this cargo." The first few days were relatively calm. The convoy rounded the north of Scotland and headed into the open sea. But after passing Iceland, everything changed. The temperature began dropping rapidly. The deck became covered with a layer of ice. The crew had to constantly break ice to prevent the ship from losing its balance. This work continued day and night because ice accumulation could cause the ship to capsize.
Thomas had noted in his diary, "My hands don't look like my hands anymore. They're covered with cracks, wounds, and frostbite marks. But I have no right to complain. My friends on deck are in worse shape. Charlie's nose tip froze while he was on watch last night. The doctor had to cut it off." On the sixth day of the convoy, first contact occurred. A German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy. This meant the moment everyone feared had arrived. The enemy now knew where they were, and an attack was imminent. No one slept that night. Everyone was at their station, eyes fixed on the dark horizon, ears focused on the slightest engine sound. At dawn, the first torpedo attack began. Thomas described that moment in his diary. At 5 o'clock, we heard an explosion. A tanker at the front of the convoy had been hit. The ship caught fire within seconds. It burned so brightly that it became like daylight in the polar darkness. The crew's screams could be heard even over the waves, but no one could help them. The moment we stopped, we would die. This scene was the bitter reality of the Arctic convoys. When a ship was hit, other ships couldn't stop to rescue survivors, because stopping meant becoming an easy target for submarines. Sailors had to leave burning ships and friends struggling in the freezing waters behind and continue on. This was one of war's most inhumane necessities. HMS Eastern Star survived the first attack without damage, but this was only the beginning. Ahead of them lay hundreds more miles of ice and darkness, and the enemy was now hunting them. Thomas ended that night with these words, "I'm thinking about the last letter I wrote to Sarah. I promised her I would return. I want to keep that promise. But among these icy waters, I feel death's breath on my neck. God protect us." On the 7th day of the convoy, the weather worsened further. An Arctic storm tossed the ships around like toys among giant waves. The wind was so fierce that standing on deck became impossible. But the crew still had to continue breaking ice, because even in the storm, the enemy threat continued. Perhaps the Germans were waiting for exactly such a moment, and they were right. At the storm's peak, the second attack on the convoy began. This time, the target was the ammunition ship right next to HMS Eastern Star. The torpedo struck the ship dead center. The explosion was so powerful that Eastern Star's crew was thrown to the ground. The ammunition ship exploded into the air along with the explosives it was carrying. Within seconds, only burning wreckage remained of the ship. Thomas was too shaken to write about that moment in his diary, but the next day he made this note. "Last night, I saw hell. There were 80 people on that ship. 80 families just lost their sons, fathers, brothers. And we couldn't do anything. We just watched and prayed." Despite its losses, the convoy continued on its way. But HMS Eastern Star's fate was written for a different ending. On the 9th day, the ship collided with an iceberg. In the darkness, due to a radar malfunction, the iceberg hadn't been detected. The collision caused serious damage to the ship's bow. They began taking on water. The captain had to make a difficult decision. The ship could no longer keep up with the convoy. They would either separate from the convoy and try to reach the nearest port, or they would sink. The decision was made. HMS Eastern Star would separate from the convoy and head for an Allied port in northern Norway. But this decision left them completely alone. There was no longer the convoy's protection. There were no longer escorting warships, just a damaged ship, an ice-filled sea, and darkness. Thomas wrote the night they separated from the convoy, "We left our friends behind. Now we're on our own." The captain openly said that everyone's chances of survival are now very low. But we won't give up. The British never give up. These words must have given that young engineer deep pride. But among the ice, pride alone wasn't enough to survive. We've reached the end of Part 1. In Part 2, I'll tell you about HMS Eastern Star's final days, the crew's desperate struggle, and the last pages of Thomas's diary. This story will deeply affect you, because what happened among those icy waters reveals both the darkest and brightest sides of the human spirit. If this story moves you, subscribe and like.
Welcome back to Part 2. We're continuing our story without slowing down. HMS Eastern Star was now alone. When the convoy's lights disappeared over the horizon, the 112 people on board sank into a deep silence. At that moment, everyone was thinking the same thing. No one is coming to save us anymore. If you've watched this video up to this point, I know this story matters to you. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, we're entering the most intense part of this drama. The ship continued taking on water from the bow after the collision. Engineers struggled day and night to plug the holes and keep the pumps running. Thomas was leading this team. He wrote in his diary, "Water in the engine room has reached ankle level. The pumps are running non-stop, but we can't keep up. Every hour, we're fighting against freezing water. My hands are so numb that I don't even feel the pain anymore." Captain Edward Morrison was an experienced sailor. He had served in World War I as well, but he had never faced such a difficult situation before. He did everything he could to boost the crew's morale. Every day, he came up on deck, talked to his men one by one, tried to give them hope. But at night, when he was alone in his cabin, he prayed too. Thomas described the captain this way: "Captain Morrison is an extraordinary man. He never panicked. He never showed that he had lost hope. But last night, as I passed by his cabin, I saw him praying. At that moment, I realized our situation is truly hopeless." The first day after separating from the convoy, the weather was relatively calm. The ship was moving sluggishly toward the northeast. The destination was the port of Hammerfest in northern Norway. It was under Allied control and had repair facilities, but between them lay hundreds of miles of ice-filled sea and German-controlled coastlines. On the second day, problems began. The ship's compass broke down. The magnetic field deviations in the Arctic region already made navigation difficult, and with the broken compass added to that, determining the course became almost impossible. The navigation officer tried to find direction using the stars, but in the polar region, clouds constantly covered the sky. Thomas recorded the situation in his diary. "We don't know exactly where we are. The captain is trying to calculate our estimated position, but in this foggy darkness, everything is a guess. Maybe we're on the right path. Maybe we're unknowingly approaching German shores. Not knowing is worse than death." Uncertainty is what wears down the human spirit the most. You can fight an obvious enemy, you can take precautions against a visible danger, but advancing blindly in the darkness, not even knowing where you are, rots you from the inside. The crew was wearing down a little more with each passing hour under this uncertainty. On the fourth day, the first death occurred. A young sailor lost his balance while breaking ice on deck and fell into the freezing waters. His name was William Jenkins. He was only 19 years old. He came from Cornwall, and this was his first sea mission. Thomas would never forget that moment. "I heard William scream and ran to the deck. He was thrashing in the water. Someone threw a rope, but his hands were so numb he couldn't hold on. We tried to reach him, but the captain stopped us. 'No one enters the water. We'll lose them too,' he said." I looked into William's eyes. I will never forget that look for the rest of my life. Hope, fear, and then nothing. Within 30 seconds, he went still. A minute later, he disappeared from sight. This scene revealed the Arctic's cruelty in all its rawness. A person's survival time in freezing waters was measured only in minutes, and often it wasn't even possible to extend a helping hand because the risk of losing others while trying to save one person was too high. William Jenkins' death deeply shook the crew's morale. That night, no one spoke. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts. Everyone knew that they could be the next victim. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe and like. On the fourth day, news of a new disaster came. A leak was detected in the ship's fuel tank. Precious fuel was draining into the sea. Engineers tried to stop the leak but failed. This meant the ship's range was seriously reduced. Whether they could reach Hammerfest was now uncertain. Captain Morrison gathered the crew and explained the situation plainly. Thomas wrote this speech word for word in his diary. The captain gathered us all on deck. "Gentlemen," he said, "I won't lie to you. Our situation is critical. Our fuel is running low, our water is at freezing point, our compass isn't working. But let me tell you something. I have no intention of losing a single person from this crew. We succeeded together. We will succeed together. British sailors never give up." At that moment, I saw a light in everyone's eyes. Maybe hope, maybe pride, maybe just stubbornness, but that light kept us standing. The speech showed how critical leadership is in wartime. Captain Morrison hadn't technically changed anything. Fuel was still running low, the compass was still broken, danger was still at the door. But those few sentences had revived the spirits of 111 men. This was true leadership. On the 5th day, weather conditions worsened further. An Arctic storm began engulfing the ship. The wind howled, waves licked the deck. The ship tilted left and right. The crew could barely stand. And worst of all, ice accumulation accelerated incredibly in the storm. Ice accumulation was one of the Arctic's most insidious dangers. Sea spray and frost created ice on every surface of the ship. This ice became so heavy over time that it could raise the ship's center of gravity and cause it to capsize. That's why the crew had to constantly break ice even in the middle of a storm. Thomas described this nightmarish night. "Last night we lived through hell. The storm was so fierce we couldn't stand, but we had to break ice. For 4 hours, under freezing wind, with sledgehammers, shovels, our bare hands, we broke ice. 3 of our friends showed signs of frostbite. One's fingers turned purple. The doctor said amputation might be necessary. And we might have to do this on a rocking ship in the middle of a storm." That night, the second death occurred. A sailor rolled off the deck into the sea during the storm. His name was Robert Thompson. He was 32 years old and came from Manchester. He left behind 2 children. His body was never found. On the 6th day, the storm finally subsided. But the ship's condition had now reached critical levels. Water level in the forward section was rising, fuel was nearly depleted, food and drinking water had diminished, and most importantly, one of the ship's engines had failed. Thomas spent hours in the engine room. He tried to repair the malfunction, but the necessary spare parts weren't available. He wrote in his diary, "The engine is completely gone. Now we're moving on a single engine. This cuts our speed in half and increases fuel consumption. Mathematically speaking, it's impossible for us to reach Hammerfest, but I've started believing in miracles instead of mathematics." That day, the captain made a radical decision. He accepted they couldn't reach Hammerfest and changed course. The new destination was a much closer, but also much more dangerous area, the Spitsbergen Islands. These islands were technically Norwegian territory, but were a conflict zone used by both Allies and Germans during the war. Thomas evaluated this decision. The captain decided to head for Spitsbergen. This increases the risk of encountering German patrols, but the alternative is sinking in the open sea. At least there's land in Spitsbergen. Maybe we can survive there. On the 7th day, finally some good news came. The lookout reported seeing land on the horizon. The crew rushed to the deck. Everyone was trying to see the black strip appearing on the icy horizon. And yes, there it was, land. Spitsbergen's rocky shores rose through the mist. Thomas wrote that moment in capital letters in his diary. "We saw land. Thank God we saw land. Everyone is crying, laughing, hugging each other. We haven't reached shore yet, but at least now we have hope." But the Arctic loves to extinguish hopes quickly. As they approached Spitsbergen shores, they encountered a new problem. The coast was surrounded by a thick ice pack. The ship had to cut through this ice to reach the shore, but could the damaged and weakened hull withstand this pressure? The captain took the risk. There was no alternative. The ship slowly entered the ice pack. At first, everything was fine. The ice was breaking in front of the ship, opening a path. But as they advanced, the ice thickened. And then, the sound everyone feared was heard, metal creaking. The ship was beginning to be crushed under the ice's pressure. Thomas recounted that moment. "The ship is groaning. Yes, I can't describe it any other way. It's groaning in pain like a metal creature. Ice is pressing from all sides. Water is rising rapidly in the forward section. The captain is about to give the order to abandon ship." The 8th day was the last day for HMS Eastern Star. The ship could no longer move. Trapped among the ice, it was slowly sinking. Captain Morrison gave the order to abandon ship. The evacuation operation was an epic of heroism in itself. The crew, in freezing cold, carried food, water, weapons, tents, and everything possible onto the ice. The wounded were carried on stretchers. Everyone helped each other until their last breath. Thomas recorded these moments in detail. Abandoning ship is like abandoning your home. For months we lived here, fought, laughed, cried. Now we're leaving it among the ice. When I took one last look, the ship had sunk almost halfway into the water. But the British flag was still flying. No one lowered it. Let it stay there. The crew set up a small camp on the ice. They were several miles from shore, but the ice was too broken and dangerous to walk across. Their only hope was for someone to find them or for weather conditions to improve so they could reach shore.
That night, the temperature dropped to -50 degrees. The tents were inadequate. Food rations were running low. And worst of all, the wounded were in critical condition. The doctor was doing his best, but resources were extremely limited. Thomas described that night. "I've never been this cold. The frost has penetrated to my bones. 5 of us in the tent are back to back, trying to warm each other. But the cold seeps in from everywhere. Charlie's breath is forming ice crystals. Sleeping means death, but staying awake is also impossible." On the 9th day, the 3rd death occurred. A sailor whose leg was broken during the evacuation died of hypothermia during the night. His name was George Wilson. He was 25 years old, came from Leeds, and was a teacher before the war. They had to bury his body in the ice because there was no soil to bury him in. That morning, Captain Morrison held a brief ceremony. Thomas recorded this ceremony in his diary. The captain said a few words for George. "This man died for his country. Whether at the bottom of the sea or under the ice, he lies in British soil. May God protect his soul." Then we all sang "God Save the King" together. Our voices were trembling. From cold or sorrow, I don't know. Maybe both. From the 10th day onward, the survival struggle turned into a complete nightmare. Food was running low. Melting ice was necessary to find water, but fuel was also limited. Every day they grew weaker. Every night they lost a little more hope. During these days, Thomas began making shorter, choppier notes in his diary. He didn't even have energy to write. 11th day. 2 more people died. Their names were Henry and James. They froze to death. They didn't even scream. When we woke up in the morning, they were lying motionless next to us. 12th day. Food is almost gone. The captain cut rations in half. Everyone is hungry, but no one is complaining. No one has the strength to. 13th day. Charlie is about to lose his eyes. Snow blindness. The doctor said there's nothing to be done. Charlie didn't even cry. "At least I won't have to see this damned whiteness," he said. 14th day. We saw something. Smoke on the horizon. A ship or a hallucination? No one is sure. The captain had a signal flare fired. No response came. 15th day. There was no smoke. We probably hallucinated. Hope hurts even more here. These notes showed the limits of the human spirit. Surviving for 15 days in the middle of the ice, hungry, thirsty, freezing, waiting for death, and losing more friends each day. This was far beyond the limits a normal person could endure. But these men weren't normal. They were British sailors, and British sailors, no matter how dark things got, never gave up. On the 16th day, a miracle happened. In the early morning hours, a real ship appeared on the horizon. This time, it wasn't a hallucination. A British destroyer, HMS Onslaught, was searching for survivors. After the convoy reached Murmansk, they had reported HMS Eastern Star as missing. The Royal Navy had launched a search and rescue operation, and miraculously, HMS Onslaught had found them. Thomas wrote that moment on the last page of his diary. "They came. My God, they actually came. When the ship appeared on the horizon, everyone started crying. Even Captain Morrison. That strong, invincible man fell to his knees and cried. I cried too. I had never seen such a beautiful sight in my life. A gray warship would normally look frightening, but at that moment it looked like the gates of heaven. HMS Onslaught rescued the survivors. Of the 112 crew members, 67 survived. 45 had perished among the ice. Among them was Captain Morrison. During the rescue operation, while waiting for the last men to board the ship, he had a heart attack and died there, on the ice. He was at his post until his last breath. Thomas recorded the captain's death. Captain Morrison left at the last moment, after saving all of us. It's as if he waited for death until his mission was complete. Maybe that's what it was. Maybe that's why he was so strong, because he had to protect us. Once we were safe, he let go. This man was a hero, a true hero. This was the story of HMS Eastern Star, a story lost among the ice, found and never forgotten. But the story doesn't end here. The ship was still there, lying among the ice, and Thomas's diary would incredibly come to light decades later. If you loved this story of heroism, subscribe and like. In the third and final part, I'll tell you how this diary was found, the discovery of HMS Eastern Star's wreck, and the traces of this story that extend to the present day. You'll also learn how the Arctic convoys affected the fate of the war and how these brave sailors' legacy lives on today.
We've arrived at the final part of our story, and we're continuing without slowing down. 67 men were rescued. 45 remained among the ice forever. HMS Eastern Star lay buried under ice and snow off the coast of Spitsbergen, and Thomas's diary returned to England with the survivors. But this story didn't end with the rescue. In fact, the real story was just beginning. If you've been watching this series from the start, you've witnessed an incredible journey so far. But I promise, this final part will affect you even more deeply. Don't forget to like the video, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. Thomas returned to England after being rescued. He spent months in the hospital. He barely avoided losing his frostbitten fingers. The physical wounds healed, but the scars on his soul never closed. He couldn't take active duty for the rest of the war. Doctors deemed him psychologically unfit to return to sea. But Thomas didn't stay idle. While lying in the hospital, he reread his diary. He relived every page, every line, every word. And he made a decision. This story must not be forgotten. The memory of the 45 friends who lost their lives should not be buried in the dusty pages of history. Thomas began expanding his diary. Drawing from his memory the accounts of other rescued crew members and official records, he wrote the complete story of HMS Eastern Star. This work couldn't be completed during the war, but Thomas dedicated the rest of his life to this project. In 1947, 2 years after the war ended, Thomas's work was published by a small publishing house. The book was titled Among the Ice, an Arctic Convoy Story. The first print run was only 500 copies. Most were distributed to surviving crew members and the families of lost sailors. The book wasn't a commercial success. In post-war Britain, people wanted to forget the war. They wanted to leave painful memories behind, rebuild, and look forward. The stories of the Arctic convoys were, for most people, just a dark chapter of the past. But for some, this book was priceless. Sarah, Thomas's fiancée, waited for him throughout the war. They married when Thomas returned. Sarah watched her husband wake up from nightmares at night, sometimes staring out the window for hours without speaking. Thomas couldn't describe what he'd experienced in words, but when he wrote the book, Sarah was by his side. They read every page together, and Sarah truly understood what her husband had lived through for the first time. Years passed. Thomas and Sarah had 3 children. Thomas worked as an engineer at a factory in Birmingham. He lived a normal life, at least from the outside, but every year on a certain day, Thomas would go somewhere alone, to the seaside. He would sit for hours and look at the horizon. That day was the anniversary of when HMS Eastern Star sank.
In 1962, Thomas passed away at 63 years old. Heart attack. Doctors said the harsh conditions he endured in the Arctic had weakened his heart. At his funeral, 12 of the surviving crew members were present. They had all aged, but they all remembered those young sailors. Together, they sang naval hymns and remembered their old Captain Morrison and the friends they'd lost. After Thomas's death, his diary and book were kept as family heirlooms. For decades, only family members knew this story. The outside world had long forgotten HMS Eastern Star and her crew. Until 1987. That year, a Norwegian expedition team was conducting research around Spitsbergen. The team was studying the effects of climate change on glaciers. And completely by chance, they made an incredible discovery. A shipwreck had emerged from beneath the melting ice. At first, the team thought it was an old fishing boat or merchant vessel. But when they examined the wreck, they realized it was a warship. On the ship's stern, frozen and faded, but still legible, was a name: Eastern Star. The news quickly spread to the world press. A British ship from World War II had emerged from beneath the ice after 45 years. Historians, sailors, and journalists flocked to Spitsbergen. The wreck was incredibly well preserved. The Arctic cold had essentially frozen the ship, frozen it in time. The deck was still recognizable. The bridge, engine room, crew quarters, they were all there. And, most importantly, items, documents, and personal objects were still inside the ship. When researchers dove into the ship, they entered a capsule where time had frozen. The sailors' personal belongings were still in place. Photographs, letters, cigarette packs, playing cards. Each one told the stories of people who had once lived and fought here. And then, the most important discovery was made. In the captain's cabin, a metal box was found. Inside the box, wrapped in a waterproof cloth bag, were documents. These were the ship's official logbook, Captain Morrison's personal notes, and, unexpectedly, a copy of Thomas's diary. Thomas apparently had a copy of his diary on the ship. Perhaps deliberately, perhaps forgotten in the rush of abandoning ship. Whatever happened, this copy waited for 45 years under the ice, perfectly preserved. When this discovery reached Thomas's family, it created great excitement. Thomas's son Michael was 50 years old at the time and had known his father's story since childhood. But finding the ship changed everything.
Michael decided to share his father's legacy with the world. He brought together Thomas's original diary, his book, and the copy recovered from the ship. He worked with historians, naval experts, and documentary filmmakers. And in 1992, the complete story of HMS Eastern Star reached a wide audience for the first time. The BBC aired a documentary on the subject. The documentary was watched by millions. Viewers were moved to tears listening to excerpts from Thomas's diary. The sailors who perished among the ice 45 years ago were finally getting the attention they deserved. But the story didn't end there either, because HMS Eastern Star wasn't just the story of one ship. It was the story of all the Arctic convoys. And these convoys were one of the most critical yet least known operations of World War II. Now, let's take a step back and look at the big picture. What exactly were the Arctic convoys, and how did they affect the war's outcome? Between 1941 and 1945, a total of 78 convoys used the Arctic route. These convoys carried more than 4 million tons of war materials: tanks, aircraft, trucks, weapons, ammunition, fuel, medicine. Stalin's armies couldn't have withstood the Nazi assault without these materials. The numbers show the scale of the operation. 7,500 tanks, 7,400 aircraft, 13 million pairs of boots, millions of tons of petroleum and food. All of this passed through the Arctic's ice-filled waters to reach the Soviet Union. But the cost of the success was heavy. 104 merchant ships and 16 warships sank. More than 3,000 sailors lost their lives. The vast majority of these casualties were British and American.
These people died thousands of miles from their homelands in freezing waters, often without leaving any trace. Winston Churchill described these operations as the worst journey in the world, and he was right. The Arctic offered conditions far beyond what the human body and spirit could endure. Minus 50-degree cold, weeks of darkness, giant waves, icebergs, and enemy attacks on top of all this. But these men didn't back down. They volunteered, going out on this route again and again because they knew the importance of the mission. Stalin's armies were stopping the Nazi machine on the Eastern Front. Every day, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and civilians were losing their lives, and the Arctic convoys were providing the materials necessary for this resistance to continue. Historians acknowledge that the Arctic convoys directly affected the war's outcome. If these materials hadn't arrived, the Soviet Union might not have been able to withstand the Nazi assault, and if the Eastern Front collapsed, Germany could have directed all its strength to the West. The success of D-Day, the liberation of Europe, even the fate of the entire war depended on the cargo carried through these icy waters. This reality made honoring Arctic convoy veterans even more important. But for decades, these heroes weren't sufficiently recognized. After World War II, Britain and America honored many war heroes. Medals were given, monuments were erected, days were declared, but Arctic convoy veterans remained in the shadows for a long time. The secret nature of the operation, the complicated relationship with the Soviets during the Cold War era, and perhaps simply forgetfulness prevented these sailors from receiving the attention they deserved. This situation only began to change in the 2000s. The surviving veterans were now in their 80s and 90s. Families and supporters, knowing that time was running out, launched campaigns. Finally, in 2013, the British government created the Arctic Star Medal. This medal was awarded to all sailors who served in the convoys. At medal ceremonies, veterans over 90 years old received their medals in tears. Some felt officially recognized for the first time after more than 60 years. Michael, Thomas's son, received the medal on his father's behalf. He would have been very proud to see this, but more importantly, he would have remembered his friends, those who remained among the ice. I'm receiving this medal for them. If you're enjoying these stories, like and subscribe. The wreck of HMS Eastern Star still lies off the coast of Spitsbergen today. The Norwegian government has placed the area under protection. The wreck is now considered a war grave. Diving is prohibited. The ship and the bones of the 45 sailors inside will remain there forever among the ice. Every year on a certain day, the British Royal Navy sends a ship to the area. As the ship passes over the wreck, a wreath is dropped into the sea, and a moment of silence is observed. This tradition has continued since 1992. Thomas's diary is currently on display at the Imperial War Museum. Visitors can see the yellowed pages through the glass. Next to the diary are Thomas's photograph and a brief biography. Every year, thousands of people visit this exhibit and read that young engineer's words.
The museum has digitized some pages from the diary. On their website, you can read the notes Thomas wrote in his own handwriting. The most visited page contains the lines Thomas wrote on the final day. They came. My God, they actually came. Thomas's granddaughter Emma continues her grandfather's legacy. Emma, a history teacher, gives lessons about the Arctic convoys in schools. She reads to children from Thomas's diary. Children are mesmerized when they hear these stories, Emma says. What my grandfather experienced shows them the real face of war. It's very different from movies and games. Real people, real suffering, real heroism. The legacy of the Arctic convoys lives on not just in Britain, but around the world. In America, there are monuments for American merchant marines who participated in the convoys. In Russia, a massive monument in Murmansk honors Allied sailors. Annual ceremonies remind us of this sacrifice. And perhaps most importantly, these stories continue to be told. Books, documentaries, articles, YouTube videos, each new generation discovers the Arctic convoys and gets to know these heroes. Now let's pause for a moment and think. Why did Thomas and his friends volunteer for such a dangerous mission?
Why did they go out on a route where death was almost certain, again and again? The answer is simple but profound: a sense of duty. These men knew they were fighting against an evil that threatened the world. Nazi Germany had plunged Europe into darkness. Millions of innocent people were dying, being exterminated in concentration camps, and every sacrifice had to be made to stop this evil. Thomas wrote somewhere in his diary, "Sometimes I ask myself, why am I here? I could be safe in my warm home next to Sarah. But then I think, if everyone thought this way, who would fight? Who would stand against this darkness? I am British. Fighting for freedom is my duty." These words reflected the spirit of a generation. The World War II generation passed history's most difficult test and emerged successfully. The Arctic Convoy sailors were among the bravest representatives of this generation. Today, almost none of those sailors are alive. The last Arctic Convoy veteran passed away a few years ago at over 100 years old. But their legacy lives on. Their stories are being told, their sacrifices are being remembered. And this is perhaps the most beautiful form of commemoration. What truly makes a person immortal is not their body living on, but their story. Thomas died 60 years ago, but his diary is still being read, his story is still being told, his spirit still inspires. HMS Eastern Star continues to lie beneath the ice off the coast of Spitsbergen. Sometimes, especially on clear winter nights, the northern lights dance above the ship. Green and purple lights seem to salute the lost souls, as if the sky is honoring these heroes. On the last page of Thomas's diary, there's a note written just before rescue. This note carries the voice of all Arctic Convoy sailors. If someone finds this diary, let them know this: we fought here in the middle of the ice for our homeland. We were afraid, but we didn't back down. We froze, but we didn't give up. We lost our friends, but we didn't abandon each other. We were British sailors, and no matter what, we did our duty. These words are still powerful 80 years later. They still inspire. They still remind us that even in dark times, ordinary people can show extraordinary heroism. And this applies to you too. You may not battle Arctic storms. You may not fight to survive in freezing waters. But when you face the challenges life presents you, remember Thomas and his friends. If they succeeded in those impossible conditions, you can succeed too. Thank you for watching this video. The story of the Arctic Convoys is one of history's most powerful human dramas, and sharing it with you has been a great honor for me. But the journey isn't over for this channel. In upcoming videos, we'll discover more forgotten heroes, more unknown stories. In the dark corners of World War II, there are many more stories waiting for the light. In the next video, I'll tell a very different story. The story of British agents who organized an incredible resistance deep in the Burmese jungles under Japanese occupation. Codename Force 136. This operation is hardly ever discussed, but the heroism within it overshadows even the best action movies. If you don't want to miss this story, subscribe now and turn on notifications. I'll finish with Captain Morrison's words: "British sailors never give up." These words were spoken 80 years ago in the middle of the ice, but they're still valid today. When you face difficulties, remember these words and never give up. If this video inspired you, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. In the comments, share what you think about the Arctic Convoys and how this story affected you. Every comment helps this channel grow and helps us tell the stories of more forgotten heroes. See you in the next video. Until then, don't forget history's heroes. Goodbye. Take care of yourselves.